Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything.
Hi all, Dr. Clark here again, and we're going to talk about the biosphere this time. The last couple lectures, we were talking about the other spheres of the planet Earth, which we talked about the atmosphere, the geosphere, and we talked about the hydrosphere. Now we're going to talk about the biosphere, and some of you, when you hear the term biosphere, you might think of this building or this apparatus. Okay, this is called the Biodome or the Biosphere 2, or there's probably lots of names for this structure that was built in Arizona in a attempt to recreate a biosphere or recreate a ecosystem that's self-sustaining. And I say an attempt because the attempt failed. As we progress, we'll talk about some different things that occurred inside the dome that made it so it was nearly impossible. Well, I shouldn't say it would have been impossible. It's highly likely that it would have been impossible for individuals, humans, to live in the dome had they not corrected the issues. That's part of the reason why they did it, though, is because we don't know everything about ecosystems. We don't know everything about the biosphere. And by trying to recreate one, you can know where the pitfalls would come in doing so. So eventually, maybe if we are to move and have people live on Mars, we would have to live in something like a biodome or a biosphere or whatever you want to call this structure. And we'd have to live in that, and we would have to know how to regulate that. And so that's one of the reasons. The other reason that they did it is to learn more about ecosystems and cycles and things like that. And we'll talk about, some of the things that they learned from it, some of the pitfalls and whatnot. Now it's still going today. It's just no one's living in it, and it's now just kind of a research center. So individuals can look at, what plants have done in that ecosystem in a given amount of time. Okay, so some of you might think of that. Hopefully some of you also think of this, the actual biosphere, the actual living organisms on the planet in their native ecosystem, interacting with the other cycles or the other spheres. Okay, so the interaction of hydrosphere, the geosphere, the atmosphere, all in combination with the biosphere. And I hope that's kind of what you're leaning towards when you think of biosphere. I want you to think of an ecosystem or life and its interactions. And we'll look at some examples of this and talk a little bit more about the biosphere. Okay, so biosphere is sometimes called the ecosphere, or sometimes the biosphere is what we call the Earth, and the ecosphere is what we call the living organisms. So you might have a biosphere, which is our planet, which includes the other three spheres. The atmosphere, sometimes called the lithosphere. The geosphere is sometimes called the lithosphere. Okay, so the geosphere or lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the ecosphere. That makes up the entire biosphere or this planet. So the terms are often interchanged and maybe have different uses and different, possibly even different definitions. But biosphere, ecosphere is dealing with living organisms. Okay, so it's the worldwide sum of all the ecosystems. So an ecosystem is a region where there's an interaction between abiotic, so remember A meaning non-biotic, so non-life, and biotic life or biotic systems. So a region where non-living systems and biotic systems interact, which is basically everywhere. Okay, so everywhere is an ecosystem. We can break those ecosystems based on quite a few different traits. What species are there? What's the precipitation? What's the temperature? These kind of things. What's the elevation? We can break up ecosystems so we can categorize them that way. But ecosystems are everywhere. Okay? Anywhere there's life, and life interacts with non-life. Okay, so zone of life on Earth, that's another way to kind of sum this up. Where are the zones of life on Earth? All right, and then ecological systems integrating all living beings. So the biosphere itself has lots of different definitions, but again, like I said before, it's all dealing with living things. All right, so it's whether it's life and you break it into zones, you break it into ecosystems, you break it into ecological systems, whatever you want to call it, it's still those places where living organisms reside and their actions or interactions with atmosphere, hydrosphere, geosphere. That is what we call an ecosphere or biosphere. Okay. So again, it includes the living interactions with the hydrosphere, the geosphere, and the atmosphere. Okay. So how do we classify them, or how do we divide them up? Okay. It's always important to look at things holistically and then take that holistic view and start categorizing it, especially when it comes to living organisms. If you put living organisms in categories, then A, it's easier to understand what it means to be that organism, or what characteristics that organism must have to fit in that category. That's good. Okay. B, we know what happens when you disrupt one of those categories, or disrupt one of those living beings within those categories. We can know the interactions between them. So it's basically a way that you can file organisms. Like, you can think of this as a filing system, and you're trying to classify the almost 2 million species that have been named on the planet today. You're trying to classify them into liked groupings. Okay? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about biosphere classifications. So the first and the most broad biosphere classification are what we call domains. There are 3 domains: archaea, eukaryotes or eukaryota, and bacteria. You can see them here: archaea, eukaryotic, bacteria. Archaea and bacteria are in a group we call prokaryotes. Okay? That prokaryote means they do not have a nucleus. Okay, so when we're talking about cells, they do not have a nucleus, which is a membrane-bound organelle that holds their DNA or RNA. Archaea and bacteria do not have one of these. Eukaryote or eukaryotes do have a true nucleus, a membrane-bound organelle that holds their information-carrying molecules. Their information-carrying molecules can be DNA or RNA. Okay, so that's the difference between those domains. It's important. Okay, there's differences between archaea and bacteria. We're not really going to get into a lot of their differences at this time. When we talk about evolution, we'll probably talk a little bit more about the differences between the two prokaryotes. There are 6 kingdoms. Okay, easy ones, archaea and bacteria, they have their own kingdom. Okay, each has its own kingdom, so they have their own domain and their own kingdom. Okay. Eukaryotes are broken up into 4 kingdoms: plants or plantae, animals or animalia, fungi, and protista. Okay? And so as we look through these different groupings, we have characteristics in which we can put things with this certain characteristic in with plants. It happens to be the shape and structure of their cells. That's what makes a plant a plant. Okay? Same thing with animals. It's the shape and structure of their cells. Okay? Same thing with fungi. It's the shape and structure of their cells. Protista, on the other hand, protista can have cells like plants, like animals, like fungi, okay, but are often microorganisms. They're often single-celled organisms. They can be multi-celled or chained together, but they're often single-celled organisms. But they're single-celled, free-swimming organisms with, or free-moving organisms with a true nuclei. That's where they differ from, say, certain bacteria that also have the ability to move throughout an ecosystem, but they do not have a true nucleus. Okay? These guys do. All right, we're going to look at some of these. You're going to look at some of these in lab. You're going to look at some protista. You're going to look at bacteria. You're going to look at plants. And you're going to look at animals, cells. And you can see the differences and why they're put into their each or own kingdom. Now, looking at this, you can then see that each group is broken up further. Okay, each group has further classification. All right, so let's take plants. They can be non-vascular or vascular. Okay, they could be seedless or they produce a seed. If they produce a seed, they can be a gymnosperm or an angiosperm. Okay, animals, same thing. It's a very broad situation. Okay, you can have organisms that are non-bilateral, which means they're radial. We talked about this in lab. Remember, radial organisms, you can divide them into along a radius. So they're not equal on just one plane, they're equal on multiple planes. Okay, so cnidarians, this is things like jellyfish and starfish and other things that would fit into a group that has radial symmetry. Okay. Not all radial organisms, though, would be branched off in the cnidarians. Okay, so some of that branching would come further down the line for like starfish, which gave rise to vertebrates. We'll probably talk about this in evolution. Okay, but nonetheless, bilateral symmetry, vertebrates. We know there's lots of different vertebrates. There's mammals, there's birds, reptiles, there's fishes, there's amphibians, lots of different things. There's arthropods, insect groups. Okay, so that's what I mean when we talk about biosphere classification. We're going to break living, all these organisms are living, we're going to break living organisms down into different groups, starting with most broad group with the domains, and then kingdoms, which is a little more specific, all the way down to species, which is as specific as you can possibly go from a definite classification point of view. Now, there are others like tribes, races, subspecies, etc., but from a classification point of view, species is it. Okay? We'll come back and look at this at a later date. All right. So life on Earth. How did life on Earth start? How did the biosphere start? We talked about how did the atmosphere start. We talked about the geosphere and kind of the different layers and what the layers are made of and kind of how that might have started. The hydrosphere, we didn't talk about how it started because we're going to come back and look at water molecules in a little more detail when we talk about water pollution and things like that. But the hydrosphere, that's associated with that atmosphere, and we talked about that direct connection. Now, life on Earth started roughly 3.5 billion years ago. Remember when we were talking about the atmosphere, where there was very little oxygen in the atmosphere, and then oxygen started to build in the atmosphere? Well, it was life that started to build that oxygen level. Photosynthetic organisms that started producing waste product that we call oxygen. Through apogenesis, okay, or life coming from non-living matter. Okay? So scientists have a hypothesis out there that all life on the planet actually originated from non-living matter. Now, we're going to go into the different experiments that have been done to suggest why this is supported with scientific evidence. Apogenesis, or life from non-living matter. So again, just like when we were talking about the atmosphere, just like when we were talking about the geosphere, there are pieces of the biosphere that we can't definitely answer the questions. Okay? We don't definitely know how life got on our planet. However, we have experiments that show that yes, life can come from non-living matter. Okay? And so apogenesis can occur. And so we'll talk about those experiments. Again, this is 3.5 billion years ago. It's very hard to do experiments that can mimic what life on the planet was like 3.5 billion years ago, but using chemistry, biology, physics, geology, using information from a bunch of fields, we can recreate the atmosphere on the planet and then recreate the ability from non-living material to go to living material. We'll talk about these experiments later. Biogenesis, we know happens, and we see it constantly, see it every day, and that is life from live material, life replicating life. Now, along these same lines is evolution, life changing over time. We're going to come back and we'll talk about the connection between biogenesis and evolution. Okay? Here you can see this is the idea around apogenesis. This picture here is, lipid bilayer or lipid membrane, not a bilayer probably, but lipid membrane, which we call a mesocell, that has captured another molecule inside of it. That molecule was most likely RNA. It can replicate itself. We know this. We've mimicked replication of RNA multiple times by itself. So it can make a copy of itself. Therefore, it can make its own proteins. If you can make your own proteins, you have a capsule to do this inside. You can capture energy. You can reproduce. You can split yourself and reproduce. Then you are alive from non-living material. Here's some living material. This is the process of mitosis. Okay, you can see these chromosomes, DNA that is being separated. This cell is going through the process of cloning itself. And so eventually it'll form a cleavage furrow, which will split this cell in two, and you'll have two identical cells. And we also know that there's ways at which you don't get identical cells in a process called meiosis. Okay? We'll look at these things as we progress. I just want to touch on them fairly briefly. All right, so the biosphere itself, Again, it is this system or this evaluation of the living organisms on the planet and their interaction with the other spheres. Now, those living organisms, except for us and the things that we possibly can take with us, never leave the atmosphere. Okay? So we do, on occasion, take organisms that are not just Homo sapien out of the atmosphere. So besides those trips out of the atmosphere, the system is completely closed. So when we talk about the biosphere, we need to talk about it being a closed system. No new living organisms are coming into the biosphere, and no living organisms are leaving the biosphere, okay? Except for our rocket ships. It's a self-regulating system. Okay? That means that the energy from one organism is eventually utilized by the energy, or utilized as an energy source for another organism. Okay? And that populations increase and populations decrease. That organisms are born and organisms die. Okay? Organisms adapt, organisms go extinct. It's a self-regulating system. Okay? We divide it into areas, okay, that we call biomes. So to make it easier to classify different organisms and domains and kingdoms and on and on and on, to make it easier to look at the interaction between organisms and their environment, we classify biomes, or classify the biosphere, into biomes. Now, this is a very simplistic map of biomes of the world, okay, with oceans and wetlands marked off, temperate forests in this light green color, tropical forests in that dark green color. But at any rate, that ability for us to divide up the biosphere allows for us to concentrate on certain regions and certain characteristics of certain regions. These biomes are mainly divided based on where they're located on the planet, so their latitude and longitude, okay, the temperature profile that area has, and the precipitation that area gets. So normally, under normal circumstances, biomes are just separated on the planet by abiotic characteristics. Where they're located, what's their temperature range, what's precipitation. Now then we can further evaluate them on what is the floral, okay, so what are the plants that occur there, and what are the fauna, what are the animals that occur. So that can further assist and break each one of these biomes further down in classification. In fact, there are some regions where the flora might tell you what that biome is. So you might have a plant which is so dominant that it's telling you that this is the region that you're going to find that plant and the animals that are associated with that plant. And that's the only region in the world that that plant occurs, okay, like the redwood forest. All right, we'll look at some examples of this as we progress. All right, biosphere and ecology. Okay? So again, the biosphere is examining life on the planet, its interactions with the atmosphere, with the geosphere, with the hydrosphere. Ecology is the study of the relationship between living organisms and their environment. So ecology is the actual study of the biosphere. So ecologists look at living organisms and how they interact with their environment. Remember, we said before, their environment could mean the atmosphere, the geosphere, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere. So how do they interact with other organisms, other living organisms? How do they interact with the water? How do they interact with the rocks, the soil, the sand, the minerals? How do they interact with the air? Okay? That's the study of ecology. So again, environment can be the geosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, or the biosphere. And I say or, but I shouldn't talk about or because most ecologists know that because it's a closed system, because the system itself regulates itself, it's not an if the interaction is affected by the atmosphere or if the interaction is affected by the geosphere. It is affected by it. There is an interaction. It's just sometimes ecologists don't look at that interaction. Sometimes they're looking at just interactions between maybe aquatic insects that live under the water, under this rock, and they're competing for the same food resource. Maybe that's the lens that they're examining the ecosystem at and doing ecology, versus looking at the holistic picture and not worrying about what the insect is, but worrying about the entire picture. How much leaves are coming into the system, how much photosynthesis is going on in these rocks, what's the trees doing with carbon, how much water is coming down, what's the atmosphere like. So normally the ecology is based on all the interactions, all four of these interactions. Okay. All right, now a couple things about Biosphere 2, or the Biodome kind of project that was done. And I said that it was a failure, or it didn't succeed like they wanted it to. And now there are a couple reasons for this. One of the main reasons is the amount of area that the Biosphere took up. Okay, Biosphere 2 took up. The amount of area was not large enough to regulate itself. Okay? It's not enough space to regulate its own self. So the microbes that were in the soil, they were robbing the atmosphere of too much oxygen. And the fluctuation in gases was too severe. Okay? You'd have a huge impulse of carbon dioxide and a huge decrease maybe in oxygen, or vice versa. Okay? So you had this decaying material. The microbes were, utilizing oxygen to decay material. The plants were not generating oxygen as a waste product fast enough, and levels started to dip and change. So what they have to do? Open the doors. They had to crack windows. Okay? They had to allow atmosphere from outside to come in. You can't do that on Mars. Okay? You won't be able to do that on Mars. Now, could you potentially bring oxygen with you and pipe extra oxygen in? Sure. But that's a lot of space trips. That's a lot of coming to that station if that was to occur on Mars. Okay. Another way that it failed is the interaction between organisms was too severe, probably because the area it took up was not sufficient. It was not big enough, so you had interactions between organisms, okay? Competition between organisms for resources, and some of the organisms were dying. And when you get, competition is fierce in a small region and there's no escape from that, You have a limited resource. Okay, let's say, an example of this could be, let's say we have a bunch of humans and we stick them in a room and they're locked in that room. Okay, this happens in like landslides or cave mine collapse. This happens when a mine collapses. Okay, and they're stuck there, and you have very limited resources. Well, what happens? You first divvy up those resources. Well, humans do this because we're smart, or we believe we're smart. We can, like I said before, one of the reasons why we're considered extremely intelligent is because we have the ability to predict the future. If you know how much food you have and you can ration that food to tell, okay, if we only eat this amount of food for the next period of time, we will last 10 days, 15 days, 20 days, whatever it might be, if you calculate that out. Okay? Most organisms don't have that possibility. If the food's available, they're going to consume it. They're going to fight for it and consume it. But even if we're talking about humans here, even if it's coming down to rationing food, there will be fighting. Okay? You will get to a point where individuals that are weakest will not be able to survive. It's the same thing that happens in ecosystems, same thing that happened in the biosphere too. Organisms competed with each other. Some organisms lost. They died out. Okay, when you have a lot of death, those microbes, that decomposition starts to explode, and you start to get those changes in the atmosphere and other things that are going on. So the system, the ability to regulate the system was off. It got way too hot. It got way too humid. Okay, the airflow was not proper. Okay, and you weren't really able to recreate the biosphere. It just was not possible at the time of that project. Now, does that mean it's not possible now? I don't know. Okay? I'm not saying it's possible. You have to have a much larger scale project than what was done if you're going to support a system. Okay? The role that winds and sun and plants and soil microbes play in everyday life is way underestimated when you try to look at projects like that. And it was underestimated in this project, the role that those organisms would play. And that's why it failed. Okay, next time we're going to dive into ecology. We're going to start talking about the interaction between organisms, living organisms, and their planet.